In the history of business, there are companies that simply make money, and there are those that change the very idea of how we see the world. This was the story of a brand that became not just a logo on a package, but a symbol of memory, joy, and moments that you wanted to keep forever. Their colors were woven into family albums. Their smell of film was felt by everyone who ever held a camera in their hands. They were there when legends were born, when people first flew into space, when history stopped at one frame. But behind the facade of success, there is always another truth, quiet, imperceptible, and it is it that determines how the story will end. This is a story not only about business and technology, but also about human decisions, fears and dreams that can lift everything to the skies or destroy everything. If you are ready to hear how one of the most brilliant companies of the century found itself faced with a choice that decided its fate, do not scroll any further, because what follows begins something that no one would like to remember. I remember my smell. The faint scent of photographic paper, mixed with the bitterness of chemicals and the warmth of fresh film, fresh from the factory. Those who held me in their hands still remember it, even if decades have passed. It was the smell of dreams that could be stopped in time. One push of a button, and you saved a piece of your life forever. I was that button. I was that click sound that people remembered better than their own heart. I didn't need to be explained. I was so obvious, so natural a part of life that I became almost transparent. Like water, like air, no one thought that I could disappear. My yellow signboard shone on the windows of shops in every city, and people knew. Here you could buy time. Not seconds, not minutes, but precisely time frozen in a photo. I've been everywhere. At weddings in small towns, where the bride is still a little trembling because the dress is heavy and the groom's gaze is even heavier. At graduations, where friends take pictures, hugging each other as if they'll never see each other again. In maternity hospitals, where tired mothers look into the eyes of their children for the first time. I've seen the faces of soldiers returning home and the faces of those waiting at the train station. I've seen the world in a moment of joy and in a moment of sorrow. I've been a witness, and I thought it would be forever. My factories sang. Yes, they sang, the monotonous but soothing hum of machines churning out film. I was an empire of steel and glass and light. Photographers loved me because I gave them the freedom to create, and I was loved by those who simply wanted to capture the moment. And the more the world changed, the more I believed that my magic had no expiration date. I didn't even notice the first cracks. I was told that times are changing, that new ways of taking photos are emerging. I smiled in response. Photo? Without film? Are you kidding? Because I knew that real photography begins when you hold a printed image in your hands. When you feel the paper, not look at the screen. But deep down something stirred. A faint chill as I watched the kids play with the new little devices that could take pictures instantly and display them right there, without my manifestation magic. It was like smoke on the horizon, still far away, but you already knew something was burning somewhere. I continued to live in my own world. Campaigns, advertisements, new camera models. People were still lining up for my products, and I told myself that nothing had changed, that it would always be like this. Because how could you imagine a world without me? How could you imagine childhood without photo albums, first trips without film shots, Christmas without the old family camera? But now, remembering those times, I see how my heart began to beat slower even then. I was too confident in my place under the sun, and this confidence became my greatest weakness. I remember one moment that somehow stuck in my memory. I was in a small photo studio somewhere in the suburbs of Chicago. A boy, about 12, came to develop a roll of film. He put the roll on the counter and said, "This is probably the last time I'm doing this." I didn't pay attention to what he said at the time. He simply took a shiny new device out of his pocket and showed me the photo on its screen. "Look, you can see it right away. And no lines." I smiled, but inside I felt something suddenly and painfully constrict. This boy didn't even realize that his words were prophetic. Because there, in his little screen, my future was already hiding. A future that I wasn't ready for at the time. I could have changed. I could have taken a risk. I could have used my experience and my name to become part of this new world. But I believed in the old one. I chose the familiar smell of film over the smell of the unknown. And that was perhaps my biggest mistake. Today, when I think back to those years, it hurts. Not because I disappeared from the pages of magazines or from store shelves, but because I didn't hear the bell that was already ringing. Silent, but inevitable. And now, as I tell you this story, I want you to know, no empire falls in an instant. The fall begins when you start to believe that you stand stronger than everyone else. But that will come later. For now, remember who I was. Remember my colors, my photographs, my magic. Because only then will you understand why the moment when everything disappeared was so loud. I remember the day I first saw it. A small, strange, almost toy-like camera. The room was quiet, except for someone trying to hide the excitement in their voice, explaining that this thing didn't need film. It didn't need me. I stared at this black plastic rectangle and tried to figure out what I was feeling. Curiosity? No, more like coldness. It was like being shown a newborn baby and told, it's going to grow up and one day replace you. This camera was built by one of my people, my own engineer. He didn't want to betray me. He just believed that this was the future. And you know what the scariest thing is? I felt it too. Somewhere deep down I knew. Yes, this would change everything. But I wasn't ready. I didn't want to be ready. At that time, I was at my peak. Billions in revenue, global markets, tens of thousands of employees. My name was synonymous with photography. I could afford to brush it off. And I did. Nice toy, I said then. But who wants to look at photos on a screen? People need prints, albums, film. It's just a fad. My mistake was that I was thinking about today, not tomorrow. I didn't see that the heart of a new world was already beating in this tiny matrix and screen. Years passed, and these toys became more and more perfect. They were lighter, faster, more convenient. They allowed me to take photos without the expense of film, without waiting for development, without chemicals, without me. I saw how young people were drawn to them, how new companies began to sprout from nowhere, offering what I did not give, immediacy. I could have jumped in, used my experience and brand to be the first in this race. And I did. In my safes lay a patent for a digital camera, one of the first in the world. I held the key to the future in my hands and locked it in a drawer. Why? Because I was afraid of destroying myself. My film was making billions, and I didn't want to tear that vein. Why launch a technology that could kill your golden cow? Logic told me to wait. My heart told me not to wait. I chose logic, and waiting became my sentence. I was still hanging on in those years. The ads were still working, people were still buying film, weddings and holidays were still being filmed with me. But there was a change in the air. Stores were starting to display digital cameras in their windows next to my film cameras. My windows. My shelves. I tried not to look away. Because every time I saw a kid with a shiny new camera showing a photo on a small screen, I felt like my factories were running a little slower. My machines weren't humming as loudly. My heart was beating a little slower. I knew I had to act. But to act was to admit that my era was ending. And I couldn't. I was too in love with my past. I now realized that this was the moment when I could have saved myself. But instead of taking a step into the unknown, I backed away. I hid the key to the future and convinced myself that the door would remain closed for many years to come. I was wrong. I felt the ground begin to shake beneath my feet, but at first I didn't want to admit it. I was comfortable in my confidence, comfortable in the story I had created, the story of how I had given the world a memory. But the world didn't ask my consent. It moved on, with new rules and new heroes. Digital cameras. When they first came out, I looked at them as strange toys, light, shiny, with lots of buttons and small screens on which you could see the photos immediately. I heard people enthusiastically discussing these new products, how children picked up these devices and forgot about my expensive but bulky films. And then the meetings began, bringing together my best people, the people who had built my empire over the years. The office was quiet. Even breathing seemed loud in the silence. Someone said, "We have to invest in digital." Someone said, "No, that will kill film, and with it us." I looked at them, feeling like this vote distribution was a trial for me. Am I ready to change? Am I ready to let go of what made me great? The key to the digital future was in my hands. I held it. The patents, The technology, the engineers, it was all ready. But I put it on the shelf. I told myself that the world wasn't ready yet, that film lives as long as we live. It was a lie I told myself. That night, when I closed the safe with the digital patents, I felt cold. Not frost, but a coldness in my heart. I knew I had made a mistake. But you can't turn back time. And then the world began to move on without me. New players, who had once been small businesses, were rapidly gaining momentum. They were not afraid of the future. They were challenging, conquering new horizons. And I felt myself gradually losing ground. My factories, which once hummed non-stop, now stood empty. I saw my best engineers and managers leave for competitors or launch their own startups. They were tired of waiting. They were looking for something new. I tried to hold on to the past, closing factories, laying off employees, changing strategies, but it was too late. Despair was eating me up from the inside. I remember a small crowd of journalists gathered in my headquarters one morning. They wanted to hear what I had to say about my crisis, about what had happened to the company that had once been a symbol of progress. I tried to speak confidently, but my voice was filled with pain and shame. I could see doubt flickering in those people's eyes. Does she still have a chance? I didn't know the answer myself. And that was the beginning of the end. I will never forget the moment I realized my name would no longer ring as loudly as it did. The world that had once held me in its arms began to slowly let go. Clients who had previously sought me out first began to go elsewhere, to new, shiny, and unknown brands that promised the instant magic of digital photography. I was a giant on feet of clay. In the struggle for survival, I did everything I could. I opened new departments, invested in digital technologies, tried to buy promising companies, launched advertising with all the power of my former authority. But it was like I remember how offices that had once been filled with a spirit of innovation were now filled with fear and uncertainty. Every piece of news about a competitor, every report of a drop in sales, would tear a hole in my heart. I felt myself slowly losing control. One of those sleepless nights, I was sitting alone in my large, empty office. In front of me lay reports, charts, forecasts. They all said one thing. And then I wondered, what will be left of me? Will anyone remember me except the older generations? Will my photographs continue to preserve stories? I knew the answer, and the truth was painful. But, despite everything, I did not give up. I was always distinguished by a thirst for life, even when everyone believed that I was doomed. I began to look for new ways, innovations, unexpected alliances. And although my empire was no longer the great power that it once was, I still had the strength to fight. I learned new things: digital art, social media, mobile platforms. I opened the door to young talent that helped me stay relevant. And even though it wasn't as bright and loud as in the past, I was still here. My legacy lives on in every photograph that captures a moment, in every smile I helped capture. My tragedy is not just about falling, but about the ability to learn, to adapt, to fight back when it seems there is no hope. And if you've ever held an old Kodak film in your hands, smelled that unique smell, or looked at the printed photos that managed to preserve history, know that I was there. I was the one who helped the world remember. But my story is not just about me. It is a story about the fear of change, about how sometimes even the strongest can destroy themselves with their own hands. It is a lesson for anyone who thinks they can stand still in a world that is rushing forward. Because time waits for nothing. As I look back, I feel a heavy burden of regret, not just for the loss of my greatness, but for not hearing the call for change in time. I regret letting fear stop me, that instead of taking the new into my hands and learning to fly with it, I tried to hold on to the past that was already melting in my fingers. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a tragedy of unheard whispers, ignored opportunities, and lost faith in myself. I was too sure that my name and fame would last me forever. But I was wrong. So my advice to you, those listening to this story, don't be afraid of change. The world never stands still, and neither can you. Learn to notice the signals, even if they are silent, and don't let fear stop your steps forward. Sometimes, in order to save yourself, you must first allow yourself to lose. Be brave. Embrace the new. And remember, true strength is not what you hold in your hands, but what you are willing to let go of to find something better. Because if Kodak can learn this too late, let it be your lesson now.